Infant formula is necessary. Most infants under 6 months rely on it, and parents should not be stigmatized for using it. But how does formula marketing affect us? And does it blur the line between necessary and desirable? We are looking at the specifics with my guest, Dr. Katie Foss, Professor of Media Studies at MTSU. You can check out her book about breastfeeding and media in the description below. When discussing infant formula, the issue of moms being judged is not far behind. Just think of the current formula shortage that has left so many parents in despair. And remember how society's reaction was to place blame on individual mothers for not breastfeeding more. This is a painful reminder how far society is from realizing that breastfeeding is a social effort. We can only hope to see increase in breastfeeding numbers by providing substantially more day-to-day support in all aspects of life, being legislative, social, and economic support, and not by absolving ourselves of the responsibility by saying it's all a mother's choice. Please subscribe, hit the bell button, share the podcast if you like it, and now enjoy the talk. I'm here today with Dr. Katie Foss. Katie, thank you for joining me again.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Today we're going to talk about formula marketing. So the media messages from formula companies depict bottle feeding as an equivalently good alternative to breastfeeding. And the American Academy of Pediatrics points out that it's an issue because it's very influential on mothers' decision to breastfeed or not breastfeed. And this has been going on for decades now. And I wondered, with the growing acceptance of breastfeeding, is there a stronger grip on formula companies to limit them in posing as an equally good alternative?
Actually, I would say that formula companies don't tend to make the claim that it's equally good, just because it's not just established scientific knowledge that it's not the equivalent. The message that formula companies typically take is, if you're not breastfeeding, here is the best of the different alternatives, which not only really fits with some of the guidance from the American Academy of Pediatrics, but also it makes sense to compete within themselves as opposed to compete against breastfeeding. They already have a pretty sound clientele because of all of the cultural obstacles to succeeding in breastfeeding. So it's more about positioning themselves as, if you aren't breastfeeding, here's where we fit, especially when we talk about US marketing to formula. Now, it's different when we talk about developing countries, and that's where it's really problematic. When it's presented as something that is perceived as equal or even superior, formula equal or superior to breastfeeding, then it can have dire consequences for people in areas that the marketing isn't as regulated.
Right. So you think in the US then, for moms, that picture is very clear as well?
I would say the issues, especially in the US, are more about marketing to women the formula as a substitute that's going to make life easier, that it's going to take the burden off mothers, and a lot of misperceptions that aren't really clear in the marketing. Like, let's slip in the formula, let's mail you free samples, let's put it at the doctor's office, let's have doctors distribute these kits, so that it's always there. And then when things get a little tough, it becomes the go-to rather than working through the challenges with breastfeeding.
Right. It's such an easy option.
Mm-hmm.
And do they changed in their ways of using, certain words and expressions, like using the WIC acronym in formula marketing that suggests endorsement by WIC, which again undermines WIC's actual aim to promote breastfeeding? Has this type of trickery been put to an end yet, or do they still exist?
It's still very much used. I do think it undermines the messages of WIC to put that endorsement on cans of formula or bottles of formula. However, I don't really see a solution unless WIC was to step forward and say, you may not do this anymore. On the other hand, we do want women who need supplies for their babies to go to WIC. So I think that it's kind of a double-edged sword, kind of a no-win, and just really emphasizes the need for a lot of counseling and support when women go to WIC for their children's nourishment needs.
Yeah, so focus on that, put more support towards that side. You mentioned in your book that there is a seemingly endless advertising budget that formula companies can work with, while advocacy groups, of course, pale in comparison. How can those advocacy groups, PSAs, compete? What can they do? What is the advice there?
It's really tough. It's tough. Anytime that you're competing with nonprofits, competing with commercial corporations where they know that that they have a lot more money to spend. I would say getting creative is a big part of it. And we've seen some of this with breastfeeding campaign tactics, like the Teach Me How to Breastfeed out of California, which is a video that was really instructive, but also really entertaining, that kind of thing, especially with emerging platforms where it's easy to share videos. But also use these technologies to reach women to help support them. Like I know that there's been mentoring programs that use text messages in which women reach out to new mothers and help them through tough times. Certainly through Zoom, where you could use videos to help instruct on videos, especially instruct new mothers through counseling. I think that's where the technology comes to play, combined with messages. Most people already know that breastfeeding is the superior way to feed a baby from a health standpoint. It's closing the gap on how do we support women. And that's where I think that even with not a high budget, breastfeeding advocacy groups can succeed, is by bringing women together both in person and through new technology.
That's right. And I think focusing on that bottleneck, on those moments of doubts when the lack of confidence might set in,
Yes.
to help through those moments, and to focus on those moments.
Oh, absolutely. And being able to reach someone at any hour and say, I'll help talk you through it. Let's do it. And also educating partners as well, and teaching them how to be good supportive partners. So if they're getting up for the 3 a.m. feeding, first of all, help women learn how to breastfeed while still in bed, sideline nursing, and then tell the partner, well, you get up and change the diaper. So mom's still getting a lot of sleep, and kind of overcoming those big reasons why women might cease to breastfeed, especially in the early months.
Right. How about, you mentioned that there is a Code of Breastmilk Substitutes, which in theory the US complies with. However, it's only really a recommendation, and companies do not have legal requirements to follow it. Is there any way to enforce better compliance nevertheless?
I would say not likely from a government standpoint in the US, but I absolutely in terms of like private buy-in, especially with social media platforms. So platforms which regulate their own content could do a better job banning formula marketing ads or banning certain types of campaigns. It's also really important that individual hospitals create supportive environments for breastfeeding. So following the code recommendations to not have supplements given, especially free packages given out to new moms, to do rooming in and other policies that help create strong breastfeeding relationships. All of that isn't directly tied into code compliance, but absolutely will increase the success of women breastfeeding, both for initiation and duration.
Right. In your book, you mentioned, I think it's a 2014 figure, that around 13% of the hospitals are baby-friendly hospitals. Do you think that figure increased in the last 8 years, say?
It's tough to say what happened during the pandemic, because the pandemic affected every area of care and every aspect of life. So I'm not sure what happened with rooming in and other policies, and even connections with babies and all that. I don't have figures on this or numbers on this, but I do think that some of the COVID policies likely hindered some of the breastfeeding relationships early on, because when you take away partners for some of it, or a network of support, women are going to have more trouble breastfeeding. But overall, the hospital, the baby-friendly policies that encourage breastfeeding have improved over the last decade.
Right. That's a good news. And just for listeners who might not be aware of this, is that in baby-friendly hospitals, formula samples are not allowed in the discharge bags that moms get when they leave the hospital. So
Right.
that's why we mentioned this, because that's a big kind of insertion point for a formula company to set in the first doubt, I guess, for a mom who is breastfeeding, but the formula is already there.
Yeah.
Almost sending the message that, yeah, you might not be able to do this.
Yes, it is really a sneaky approach, and that really is the dominant messaging that formula companies use. Insert doubt, you might not be able to do this when you can't do this, like that kind of message. Oh, here you have this, and oh, it's given at the hospital, so it must be just as good.
Yeah.
So they don't directly say it's not,
Yeah.
it's the same.
Yeah.
However, you have a whole kind of array of tricky things they do to insert doubt and put their formula positioned as what you're going to use when you can't succeed.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very true. We talked a little bit about formula marketing in social media, which is clearly much harder to trace or regulate because it's all based on individual sponsorships and financial incentives for individuals. How much do you think it has grown, like compared to the normal advertisement of formulas doing? How much the formula marketing has grown due to social media?
I am sure it's just exploded because the formula marketing is so based on algorithms and how individuals are clicking. One can imagine that as soon as someone clicks on one free coupon, they're going to get all formula marketing just bombarded to them over time. I don't see it a lot since that's not what I'm currently looking up. Of course, if I was researching another book on this, then I would get all of that as well. But it's hard because it's a lot more difficult to regulate than our other forms of marketing, where you'd have more gatekeeping with television, right? You don't have so much with social media. So, and then we can also think about how different people, like influencers talking about, oh, where I'm using this formula for my baby, is another form of sponsorship that may not be clear to the consumer that it is that they're being paid or provided with free formula to say such things.
Yeah, and it also has that added feature of coming from a person, which has a much more impact. So listening to somebody who you think is your peer, somebody whose opinion matters, has a much stronger effect than just a cold advertisement.
Yeah, and it's a lot less overt. It's hard to tell, okay, does this person really believe in this product, or were they just provided with free formula and then decided to talk about it?
Yeah.
And I would say with any kind of vulnerable audience or in vulnerable moments, it's even harder to discern what is an ad and what's not.
Yeah, yeah. I think we're starting to get a little bit desensitized against this type of advertisement because it's just the way advertisement is in any aspect of our lives. We kind of develop a little bit of resistance to this,
Yes.
I hope, but still, it definitely is creating additional impact.
Well, I think about like mommy blogs, for example, and if someone you regularly follow is just talking about the formula that they use, again, an endorsement that you may not be aware of.
Yeah, exactly. And they might talk about something else before where I developed a sort of connection with their personality. And based on that, riding on that already existing trust, then yeah, an advertisement for a product that or something that I didn't even think I care for, suddenly I do care for because that person does care for it.
Yep, absolutely.
Talking about advertisements, I would like to talk about the Sisterhood of Motherhood video, the famous Similac ad back a few years ago. And in case listeners didn't see it or don't remember it, it's an ad that came up about and became very popular about 10 years ago or so. It's set in a playground. You see a range of parents arriving, representing different parenting styles, like one is using buggy versus the ones who carry the baby, working moms via stay-at-home moms. And they're all having a little dig at each other, at each other's parenting styles. ready to jump at each other's throats until a buggy starts to roll down the hill, and then they all jump to save the baby as one. And then the line comes up, no matter what our beliefs, we are parents first, followed by the Similac sign. And there is two things I would like to discuss here with you is, first of all, what is great about this ad. And second is what is very wrong about this ad. So first of all, what's great about it. So it's clear, it's a strong positive message. We all bonding together as being a parent, shouldn't be focusing and criticizing each other for our choices. Why does it have to be a commercial company who tells us this? Such a great, funny way of telling us something so truthful and becoming so popular for it. Why does it have to be a company?
Yeah, I totally agree with you, because I like the bandwagon approach that it takes a village way, kind of the overarching message aside from who is sponsoring it. I don't think we would see a PSA like this just because PSAs have very clear health campaign messages, and kind of all together now doesn't really help, although they could flip this and make this a breastfeeding ad if it was people coming together to say, good for you, I'm glad you're breastfeeding. That would be fantastic, and they should make that. But again, a lack of funding and then coordinated dissemination and implementation of such campaigns is likely why we're not seeing more ads like that. But I agree with you that there's a lot of good messaging within this, although I hate that it's sponsored and created by Similac.
I do feel a sense of a responsibility there for an organization, advocacy groups, PSA, something, because the only message that's coming out from organizations like this is that breastfeeding is very important. It's very important for the health of your baby, but it doesn't resonate with the message that we understand you, we understand your struggle, we get it. That's all missing. And if we don't address that, then we're handing over all this opportunity to companies to say that to us. And with that, I think we can focus on what is negative and what is wrong with this.
So aside from having a video that is sponsored by Similac, the problem with this is that, as we've talked about before, it is presenting breastfeeding or formula feeding as just another choice, equal to how do you carry around your baby? Do you use a stroller, or do you carry on your front or on your back? Do you cloth diaper? Do you disposable diaper? It's not the same. And it sets it up as a parallel to those other decisions that you make, when we know that breastfeeding is very much a public health decision. It's not the same as these other things, these minor choices that parents make. And when it's presented like that, again, that's the sneaky way of the formula companies. When it's presented like that, it looks like an equal without saying it's an equal, and takes away that public health frame that is so vital for understanding why everyone should care about the success of women breastfeeding.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. I think that's what they did very cleverly. They took breastfeeding out of the public health domain and just landed in with other playground type of disagreements between parents. You mentioned in your book a PSA from the 2000s that instead of emphasizing the benefits of breastfeeding, it highlights the health risks of not breastfeeding. And at that time, it wasn't long-lived. But I wondered, would nowadays, with a much stronger support toward breastfeeding, would a strong PSA like that be accepted?
Especially the PSA of the woman riding a bull, and that's the equivalent of not breastfeeding. I still don't think so. I think it could get some maybe some traction on social media, but it is tough because it strips away the complexities of helping a woman succeed in breastfeeding. I absolutely 100% think that we need to frame breastfeeding as a public health issue, but it needs to be a community health issue. And how do we come together to create that breastfeeding culture that help women succeed? When they show the woman riding on the bull, it's a really provocative image and gets you thinking about the risks of not breastfeeding, but it once again kind of ties it down to an individual woman and blames individual women for not breastfeeding instead of looking at a community. So I think there are ways to carry along that message of it being a public health issue without blaming individual women. And I think that's really all that did, although it certainly raised a discussion about risk.
Yes, definitely. This particular ad, the critic about this ad was that it was considered guilt-inducing for formula feeding mothers. How do you see that argument?
Because it was one on individual women taking risks with their pregnancy, and that being the equivalent of not breastfeeding. I actually think that this could work if we were talking about milk substitutes in the 1800s, where the risk of not breastfeeding often meant much higher infant mortality. Or we could take it to developing countries where there's a lot of contaminated water used, and infant mortality is high when you use any kind of substitute for breastfeeding. But I don't think it works in the same way when we're talking about developed countries and commercial formula, although it can be very risky and absolutely, especially with contaminated formula, which can happen, it can be very risky, but it is guilt inducing. It focuses on individual women, and just isn't the best way to try to get the message that we need to create a climate that is supportive, and it's not just about individual women. I also think that it'd be clearer and more effective to list out the actual risks of not breastfeeding, such as higher incidence of diabetes, for example, higher risks of allergies, and all of those scientifically proven ones, rather than making it some kind of abstract metaphor simile for not breastfeeding.
Yeah, I agree there. I think the bull advertisement was, I understood the message of it, but it still added a lot of other big question marks.
Right. It was well intentioned, but it didn't get implemented well or executed well.
Yeah. A bit more budget would sort it out.
Yes, it would.
Okay. Do you have any final thoughts?
Just that I do wonder about the implications of the formula shortage. And I do think that breastfeeding advocacy groups absolutely should use the recent breastfeeding short, or the recent formula shortage, to carry out the message of just how important it is for us to create a supportive environment for breastfeeding women, instead of looking to what's going to happen to these babies who are formula fed, especially in a time of a shortage. How can we make sure that we create and establish a foundation so that more babies are breastfed, so we're not worrying about a formula shortage?
Exactly.
We should use this moment to progress things. And again, think about that community and that climate. I cannot emphasize enough that it's not about blaming individual women for not succeeding when they're set up to fail. And much of it is because of the formula marketing. It's all about coming together to create the best possible long-term environment for women to breastfeed their babies.
I absolutely 100% agree. It's a social responsibility. It's not a personal matter. It's a social matter.
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you very much for your time, Katie.
Yeah, thank you for having me again. I enjoy talking to you.
Last week in episode 4, we talked about how a poster campaign could help society to grow used to the sight of breastfeeding in public. I asked if you could send in some poster ideas, and I would like to share this one with you. One of our listeners, David, used the cover photo of our last episode. It is a photograph from the 1930s showing a mother comfortably breastfeeding her infant in public, sitting in the company of 2 men, one of whom she is even sharing a smile with. David used this photo and added 2 lines. On the top, it reads, "It's great that we live in an open-minded society." And at the bottom, it reads, "Unlike our great-grandparents." I find this to be a great poster idea. It's quirky, but it doesn't put anybody directly on the spot. And it shows that not long ago, in our society, breastfeeding in public was a completely acceptable sight. And the 1930s was a modest era when skirts that were higher than knee height were considered indecent, and yet people were able to disassociate seeing a breast when breastfeeding from any sexual connotations. So thank you for the poster idea. And if any other listeners have contact with organizations who could run this poster campaign, please bring this to their attention. Next Monday, we will have an end of year special episode. I long wanted to invite someone for a chat who would have a thing or two to say about breastfeeding in public and wouldn't mind to share his honest opinion. I found the perfect candidate in comedian BILL BURR. Now, he might not ever come to our podcast, but we will review his podcast on the topic. Him and his wife, Nia Renee Hill, covered the topic of breastfeeding in public a few years ago, and next Monday we will review that episode and fill in all the missing points of argument that might have put their views in a different light. I hope to see you all next Monday.